All right, teachers, let's be honest. I want you to raise your hand if you have ever carefully planned a lesson only to have it go utterly and completely wrong. That's right. All right, me too. So we're in luck because our next speaker, Alvaro Peters, who teaches speech and composition at KIPP Academy Lynn Collegiate, has also experienced this. And he's going to tell us about how a classroom activity gone awry completely changed the way that he talks to his students about oppression and liberation.
Educators, let's be honest for a moment. How many times have you recited the phrase and pleaded with our young people to be the change you wish to see in the world? Now, how many times have you given them any tools to actualize on this noble promise? Well, it doesn't help that our antiquated education system teaches our young people how to live in this world, but not how to change it. Naturally, as a 9th grade teacher, I think a lot about this dilemma. I think about how to shock our students into becoming change agents. And myself, like I'm sure a lot of you in the audience tonight, spend a lot of time trying to get our students' heads out of their cell phones and into the world. And I don't know about y'all, but if I see one more flower tiara or a doggy-eared Snapchat filter, I might just lose my mind. So, in the beginning of the year, I did what most well-meaning, social justice-driven teachers would do, and we did the privilege walk. See, my hope was to showcase to my students the invisible and, to be honest, unearned disadvantages they have simply by being a minoritized person in our world. So, one brisk December morning, I wrangled about 121 of my students, around 20 staff members, and we went outside to do the walk. So as soon as they were lined up side by side, I began to read the statements aloud. Take a step forward if one of your parents has attended college. Up stepped a few of my students, and a handful more, and then a couple more. I thought to myself, that's interesting. Okay. Take a step forward if at least one of your parents owns a business. And yet, a few more students stepped forward. And see, at this point in time, my plan began to crumble before my eyes. So, I said another statement. Take a step backwards if your race can be used against you to explain your faults. Not a student of color moved. I'm guessing they didn't hear me. Take a step backwards if your race is used against you to justify or explain your faults. One or two students pitied me, I guess, and stepped backwards. And see, by the end of the walk, around 20 or 30 minutes later, what you had was a handful of my students of color ahead of the white staff members. Yeah. And see, this never happens. Y'all laughing because it never happens. And so in my head, I thought, damn, okay, what am I going to do? I realized that my plan was now down the drain. But see, mama didn't raise no punk, and I wasn't going out without a fight. It wasn't that simple. I realized that I could quickly figure out the situation if I thought about it. Now, on our way back to my class, did I figure it out? Absolutely not. But I realized I could use this experience as a data point to shift my curriculum. So by the time we got back to my classroom, I asked a couple of debrief questions, and I got real serious. Explain to me why none of you students moved backwards about that question on race and how it can be used against you. Raymond in the back, of course, raised his hand. Well, what about Obama? He was the president and he's black. Sadly, prior to taking my class, a number of my students, including a lot of the country, if we're frank, believed that racism ended with Obama's election. Yep, that he simply wiped it out with his radiant smile and silky smooth voice. That it just vanished like that overnight. Sort of like the money I used to stash in my underwear jar as a child. Yeah, you remember that, Pops? So, this is to say that many of them couldn't quite figure it out. Like, how do these systems of oppression exist when our country elected a black man as our leader? It was going to be a rude awakening for many of them. Next question. How did y'all make sense of the fact that students of color were ahead of all of our white staff members? This time, Brianna's hand shot up. Well, Mr. Peters, times are different. Our parents, more of them are going to college, and they're working very hard to give us what we have. So it's easier for us. And I was blown, speechless by this statement, but a little conflicted because shouldn't we be celebrating the fact that our communities of color have some type of palpable progress? I mean, if we're honest, our lives are infinitely easier than our ancestors. But what about police brutality, the wage gap, prison industrial complex? No. Our lives aren't going to be simply easy for us. But if that's what our students are picking up, then we got a problem. Because our schools simply will not shield them on their way home. Their diplomas don't double as some type of indestructible bulletproof vest. So to our black and brown youth, the idea that it's easier for us is simply setting them up with a life-threatening false sense of security. Now, if that's the case, what do we do about this? Do we teach them about these systems or pretend they don't exist? In my opinion, silence is violence. Now, I also understand that even though silence is violence, a lot of us adults in the audience, we choose very deliberately to withhold this information from our children in hopes of crystallizing the hope that they have. And I get that, sort of. But on the other side, at worst, we begin to perpetuate the same systems and circumstances that have plagued our communities for centuries. So I ask you tonight, which will it be? Option A, allow them to be blindsided by a system that is bent on their destruction. Or option B, teach them how to recognize and navigate these systems so that they have a fighting chance. Audre Lorde explains to us that, quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And using her words as our North Star, we must provide our young ones with the knowledge of systems, or KOS for short, to reveal the man behind the curtain, so to say, like on that classic scene of Wizard of Oz. Y'all remember that? The entire film, we thought the wizard was some indestructible superior being, only to find out that he was my size. Yeah, it's true. And see, I'm not trying to say that political revolution and restructuring will be easy, but remember this. Systems are comprised of human beings, much like you and I, and therefore they can be manipulated and infiltrated to benefit us for once. Now, luckily, I've had the pleasure of teaching a strictly social justice course at KIPP Academy Lynn, and over there we call it speech and comp. And if I'm being honest with you, being the bearer of bad news, the person to tell them that oppression is real and it's undeniably omnipotent, right? And that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention, has been a lot like telling precious little infants that Santa Claus doesn't exist. And I apologize if I ruined Christmas for some of y'all. So we got some babies in here, some young ones. But see, anyways, back to the point. Creating this curriculum from scratch wasn't an easy task, if I'm being 100% honest, but it was worth it because I am certain that I exposed them to some of those systems that seemingly control our lives. And I want to share with you a couple of highlights. At the beginning of the year, we started off with the power of self-identification through original spoken word. After that, we moved on to the 4 I's of oppression and critical consciousness. We then tackled race and racism from both the scientific and a sort of historic perspective. And then we tackled cultural hegemony, white privilege, white fragility, gender and sexuality, and boy, that one was rough. And then we'll soon go on to tackle prison industrial complex, food industry, and immigration. Now, in the audience, you're probably thinking one or two things. The first, boy, that Mr. Peters is boring. Fair. Or two, okay, they have these fancy tools and terms and theories, but what do they actually do with it all? I'll answer the second part. We'll get into the first one. If you know anything about critical consciousness, you realize that there is a crucial non-negotiable, essentially linking theory to practice, the sort of so what, now what, if you will. And I think that one of the ways they're able to practice this KOS is when we pause to get privy. In other words, we pause our curriculum to get privy, knowledgeable, hip, of what's going on in the world around them. All right, from police brutality, school shootings, the resurgence of the slave trade in Liberia, our students have the space to use their KOS as a lens to interpret the world. And considering that KIPP is comprised of a lot of immigrant families, I think perhaps one of the most effective and memorable KOS moments is when I had each and every single one of my students call up congresswomen and congressmen to support the maintenance of DACA. Months later, I had them all write individualized letters to Speaker DeLeo and Governor Baker, and then we followed up by participating in the Children's March at the State House. And see, all this and more becomes possible, but only if schools adopt the KOS philosophy. Perhaps not in a required core course like speech and comp, which is my suggestion here, but truthfully, pausing to get privy, that's undeniably and universally adaptable, be you the STEM, humanities, or the arts. So what I would like you to do next time an injustice rolls across your news feed or your newspaper, because I know some of y'all still do that out here, I want you to do two things. One, recognize that your students aren't blind and they have opinions that matter. Two, print out an article or two, hand it to your students, have them read and discuss. Mind-blowing, right? Tell me about it. Now, this is all to say that if our schools do not teach KOS in some shape, form, or fashion, then we are failing our future. We know that right now, our society is in desperate need of capable, fearless leaders that have a deep sense of moral conviction. And as a result, our schools must become that training ground to arm them with the KOS needed to go out into the world and combat and confront oppression on the front lines. I'm talking about the fight of their lives. Will you be that training ground? Educators in the audience, realize that every day you wake up, you have an option. Will you reject the realities that cripple and paralyze our hope? Will you refuse to normalize injustices? Will you provide them with the tools needed to dismantle the master's house? Because I'm certain if we do all these things, our children will go on to actually become the change we all wish to see in the world. Thank you.